There is a huge high stakes meeting, actually, a whole series of meetings happening in Washington, D.C. this afternoon between the United States and Ukraine, between the United States and Europe, and between the United States, Europe, and Ukraine, all on trying to find out if there's going to be a way to end the war. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the meeting today is the most consequential meeting that we've had literally all the way back to, let's say, September, October of 2021, when the buildup for this war started, and today. This is probably bigger even than what happened in Istanbul in 2022, or at least the biggest since then, with the most potential. This is from President Trump just about 12 hours ago, I think, when he published this. President Zelensky of Ukraine can end the war with Russia almost immediately if he wants to, or if he can continue, or he can continue to fight, he continues to say. Remember how it started. No going back to Obama giving Crimea 12 years ago without a shot being fired, and no going into NATO by Ukraine. Some things never change, he says. So that is really both declaratory, it's very ominous, it's also very clear on what President Trump, where his mind is entering this. He's not entering this discussion with Zelensky to have some sort of conversation about, hey, what do you think? How's this? What do you think? What would you like to see where this is going to go? I think he's pretty clear on that. Zelensky has made sure that it's very clear on this because he continues to make a number of statements, a number of comments, which we're going to get to in a second. But it's impossible to talk about a meeting in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky without some recollection of what happened the last time these two got into a meeting. You may recall that in late February of this year, Zelensky came to meet with President Trump. It was supposed to be a performative deal in front of cameras. They were going to glad hand a little bit, answer a few questions, and then they were going to go sign a minerals deal. They were going to have a negotiated dinner or lunch rather following that. And instead, this happened.
God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You don't
God
know that.
bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no
answering on
position
this
to
question.
dictate that.
That's exactly
Remember
what
this.
you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
You
We're going to feel very
you will
good.
Feel influence.
We're going to feel very
I'm
good and
telling
very
you,
strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not
Mr.
in a good
Brown,
position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing
You
cards.
don't have the cards right there. That was the kind of the famous takeaway from that. And Trump said, yeah, we listened to you. We're going to end up getting sucked into World War III and all that kind of thing. Now, I think I said on our show afterward, and certainly I thought that's it. Zelensky walked off the ledge. He fell out. And now Trump, who doesn't like to be embarrassed ever, much less in the Oval Office, I figured that's going to be it. Now Trump is just going to give him an ultimatum and say, you either agree to the terms I'm willing to accept or you're on your own. Unfortunately, that's not how it happened back then. And it's potentially instructive as to what's going to happen today because Zelensky left that meeting, went to London, I think was the very first place that he went after that, where Keir Starmer was waiting for him with open arms. They had a big emotional meeting. They sat in front of the fireplace. The fire was cooking. Everything was warm. And he was greeted with enthusiastic applause at 10 Downing and all that. And then to continue on with the rest of Europe, everyone was behind him. Zelensky never backed off of what he said then. He never backed off of his contentions and what he wanted to get out of this. He did not submit to what Trump wanted. And again, I thought that with that basically in your face repudiation of what Trump had wanted, then Trump was going to walk away, but he didn't. And now then we drifted along all these months later. Now here we are in late August, still with the situation unresolved. So the question is going to be today, what is going to happen? Now, I think that President Zelensky is not going to repeat what happened in February, because I think he knows that any kind of a verbal break and an argument kind of situation would not suit him well. And I think probably Trump would walk away at this time because it's just not going to happen twice. But what is going to happen? And I want to go over a little bit of what, well, first of all, I want to tell you kind of where we are, the timeline. What's being reported by American media is that somewhere around 1 p.m. today, President Zelensky is first going to meet with President Trump personally. And I think actually Trump is going to have some photo opportunities with some of the European leaders even before that, maybe around noonish. But the first meeting is going to take place at 1 o'clock with just President Trump and Zelensky. And then about an hour later, he's going to invite the European leaders into it. And we're talking about, this is big. I mean, this is a major. This is why I tell you this is a major summit. Europe is bringing out all the heavy artillery, so to speak. They're bringing Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, Merz, the chancellor of Germany, Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of Britain, Manuel Macron, Meloni from Italy, Rutte, the chairman of the Secretary General of NATO. I mean, all of the big wigs are going to be there, and so he's going to have them in a meeting after that with Zelensky himself. So it looks like that the stage is being set for Trump to say with Zelensky, all right, based on what I just talked about to Putin, just a few days ago, here's what I'm willing to support. Where are you? What are you going to be willing to do? Trump has said kind of conflicting things in between now, the time with Putin and now, where he said on the one hand, I'm not going to make a deal. That's not up to me. And the other side, he says, I make deals. That's what I do. So I think he's going to try to find some happy medium between the two of, he wants a deal, but he does know that he has to have Zelensky's submission and capitulation into this, or at least agreement. If capitulation isn't the right word, probably it is, because Zelensky is very clearly has in mind what he wants to do. And so far publicly, it's quite far away from what President Trump said he's willing to do, what he said the Russians were willing to do. And primarily that includes, as he said, land swapping and other kinds of issues like that, especially from the Russian side. They have a separate issue, which is also very far away from where Zelensky is. And the question is going to be, is it even possible for Trump to bridge the gap between the two? I doubt very seriously it is. I don't know that this is something you can bridge. I think you got to get one party to go all the way over to the other side, or the vice versa. The side over here, the Russian side, is in the unquestionable dominant position, and it seems pretty unlikely in human affairs that they would ever consider moving over to the other side or even make major concessions. Although there is one caveat with that. I'll get to that in a minute, because there's one thing that was said by Steve Witkoff yesterday on American television, which opened a lot of eyes, certainly mine. But the devil's in the details and the definitions. We want to see what he means by the term security guarantees. Let me not get ahead of myself. First of all, let's take a look at what Zelensky has said. This is what Zelensky said yesterday before leaving Europe to heading to the United States. He had a joint press conference with Ursula von der Leyen, and here's what he had to say.
Putin has many demands, but we do not know all of them. And if there are really as many as we heard, then it will take time to go through them all. It's impossible to do this under the pressure of weapons. So it's necessary to cease fire. The constitution of Ukraine makes it impossible to give up territory or trade land.
Okay, those two things right there are huge to understand. You may recall that Trump a week or so ago openly mocked Zelensky for saying, oh, it's against my constitution, I can't swap land. Trump said, yeah, you can't. You do all kinds of things that are against your constitution. This is war, and you can do that. And then now, despite Trump already saying that, here again, Zelensky, on the eve of coming here, says, I will not swap land. My constitution forbids it. And this requirement that there has to be a ceasefire before there are end-of-war negotiations. And that, again, is completely contrary to anything the Russians have ever said that they're willing to do. They have always said very consistently, there will be no ceasefire, but we will be willing to negotiate. Also, more on that in just a second here. Don't want to get ahead of myself, but I do want to, it's important to see these things in context as they go through. This is what Zelensky is saying. He also said in a X post that he published out earlier today, since he made that one, he says things like, there can't be a situation like 2014 when they lost Crimea. He said, I'm not going to have security guarantees that turn out to be nothing. He said, because that's just used as a springboard for new attacks into 2024. He also cited the 1994 Budapest memorandum, where he said, we don't want any fake security guarantees like that. And what he's referring to, if you're not familiar with that 1994 situation, that's when there was an issue between the Soviet Union and the West, where they said, hey, if Ukraine is willing to give up its nuclear weapons, then we'll have territorial guarantees and all this kind of stuff. And at the time that was said, I don't think anybody even contemplated that those security guarantees would be against Russia. I think that the primary thing was there were concerns more about whether the West would take over Ukraine than the East would take over Ukraine, since they were both in the USSR, et cetera. But there may have been some of both sides. That's neither here nor there. What is here is that there were some statements to that effect. Also important to understand that those nuclear weapons didn't actually belong to the government of Ukraine. They didn't have operational control of them. They were just physically located on their territory. So once they became an independent nation, they had physical control of them. So something had to be worked out. The Budapest Memorandum was the result of that, which then shipped them off, I think, to Moscow for decommissioning, et cetera. Anyway, they took care of them at that point. Important to understand that Budapest Memorandum did not provide any kind of security guarantees in terms of an Article 5 situation. It had words on a paper, but there was no enforcement mechanism for anyone. And that was by design. That wasn't an accident. Nobody was willing to go to war over Ukraine. Nobody in Russia, nobody in the West. So that's why they intentionally did not put that in there. It's unfortunate. That's just kind of the way things work in international relations. They put the words on there to make everybody happy enough to get the deal done, to get the nukes out. All we cared about was it's consolidated. We don't want nuclear weapons in the control of a bunch of different countries. We just want them under the control of one country, and that was Russia, because they felt they knew they couldn't get rid of those other ones that Russia had, of course. So better to have them consolidated into one where they already had them, rather than spread out other places. So we didn't really talk about nobody ever intended actually fighting for Ukraine. And that's why they say it was more like declarative stuff. We don't want this to happen, and we guarantee that we'll be angry if there's ever an issue, which kind of is how it worked out here. But from Zelensky's perspective, he says, I don't want one of those situations. I don't want a situation like 2014 when they lost Crimea. And he said, because that's just a springboard, in his view, to 2022. Now, it's fair for him to make that claim, that analogy from a Ukrainian perspective. I can see where they may come to it. Obviously, others have a very different perspective of both the 1994 situation, because from the Russian side, they're saying, yeah, nobody was talking in 1994 about NATO joining into Ukraine. That completely changed the situation. So now then the terms were violated in their view. So it's a different situation. They also see the Crimean situation very differently. You don't have to agree with either side. The point being that both sides are very clear on what they believe and what they think their situation is. So the thing that does matter is, what can you do and what can't you do? What do you have the power to coerce the other side to do, and what do you have the power to defend against the other side? That's what this all comes down to. Words are only important insofar as they can match ground truth reality. Never, never forget that. So you can have principles, you can have values, you can have preferences all day long. But if they can't be matched up with ground truth reality, then it's nothing but empty rhetoric, in a sense, like the 1994 memorandum turned out to be. Let's move on here. I told you that was a conference between Zelenskyy and Ursula von der Leyen, who was speaking, of course, for the European side yesterday. So entering this conversation today with that big group of Europeans, here's where their chief said they stand.
Ukraine must be able to uphold its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. There can be no limitations on Ukrainian armed forces. International borders cannot be changed by force. These are decisions to be made by Ukraine and Ukraine alone. And these decisions cannot be taken without Ukraine at the table.
Okay, first of all, just on the surface of it, she's dead wrong, obviously. It's not Ukraine's decision to make a loan. That's absurd. Europe standing right there with them. The United States is also a kind of an important stakeholder. So it's absurd to say that it's on Ukraine's alone. No, they have to. She is right that you ultimately cannot talk about Ukraine without Ukraine. Trump did in Russia, but he can't do it now. And if there's going to be an end, they do have to be a part of it. And Trump recognized that, hence, here's this meeting coming up in just a few hours from now. So the question is going to be, what are we going to do? And what are the two sides, and these two sides I'm talking about, Ukraine and Europe, what are they going to be having in this meeting with Trump today? Because you see, I just told you Zelensky's position. Now, Ursula von der Leyen actually laid out even more, talking about how there needs to be strong security guarantees. We have to have territorial integrity. There's no demilitarization, big one from the Ukraine side. There won't be any of that. We have to make them, she said in subsequent comments, we need to make them a steel porcupine, meaning we have to really build up their military and defense capabilities. All these things she's saying, this is what the end of war negotiations have to look like. That's kind of contrary to what the Russian side is viewing and what they probably told Trump in Alaska just a few days ago. So the question is going to be now, what's going to happen in this meeting today? Now, obviously, Trump wants to avoid any kind of a blow up, but he's also got to bring all this together with what he just heard in Alaska, and those things are miles apart. And you don't see a narrowing of the side so far by the European and Ukrainian side. I mean, even as recently as this X post that was earlier today by Zelenskyy, these comments less than 24 hours ago by Ursula von der Leyen and Zelenskyy talking about what they want. I mean, Trump has been very open about what he's been talking about. He said it's going to have to be land swapped and all this kind of stuff. That's obviously not territorial integrity. That's saying we have to recognize what's true on the ground. Trump's going to have a very, very difficult time bringing the two sides together. But there's one thing that I also want to point out that happened yesterday. That is Steve Witkoff, who started all this the Wednesday before the Alaska meeting by saying, hey, I talked to Putin and we had some general framework, which led to the Alaska meeting, which is now leading to the one today. Witkoff on TV was asked yesterday about the security guarantees, and he said something that really got my attention.
The United States is potentially prepared to be able to give Article 5 security guarantees, but not from NATO, directly from the United States and other European countries. That is big. I mean, really big.
Does it mean boots on the ground? What does it mean? But logistically?
I think part of the discussion that we're going to have on Monday throughout the day, because there's going to be breakout sessions there, is exactly the specifics of what the Ukrainians feel that they need. Because remember, as mediators, we were at this summit to advance the Ukrainian position, and we did that, and we did it successfully. Now it's for us to drill down on the granular details of exactly what the Ukrainians need to give them a sense of security in the future, and, by the way, what the Europeans need as well.
Now, the biggest surprise on that, well, there's two big ones, that the United States said we're willing to give security guarantees for Ukraine. Security guarantees. The United States, he said us by name, not even the West, not Europe, but the United States, he said. And when Shannon Bream thankfully pressed him on there, wait, are you talking about American boots on the ground? I mean, and he just said, well, we'll talk about all that kind of thing. Okay. It was some people, or in separate reporting, there was that he said that there would be Article 5 light terms for Ukraine. It would not be NATO. They specified it wouldn't be NATO, but it could be others. Of course, he obviously there said it could be the United States, could be one of those others. And you got to understand Article 5, and I think this is important too. When Shannon Bream asked him, would you put U.S. boots on the ground? The obvious answer, the truth is, of course not. Let me just say categorically, nobody, not Poland, Romania, France, Germany, nobody. I don't care what they say in public. I'm just telling you categorically, they are not going to go to war with Russia that could easily go to nuclear war and have their people go into a fight and lose their soldiers, even on the best case scenario, over Ukraine. They are simply not going to do it. They will be rhetoric all day long, and they will talk till the cows come home, but they are not going to literally fight to the death for Ukraine. They're simply not going to do it. And so let's just start from there. Rhetoric aside, everybody who, in terms of how this is going to work out, really understands that that's the case here. But that's what, so I think when he's talking about security, Article 5 security guarantees, Article 5 like security guarantees, I suspect that they probably are thinking about the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which had words on a paper, but specifically no enforcement mechanisms. One of the things also that was claimed that Witkoff said that Russia agreed to this, that say they're willing to talk about this. Okay, let's consider again definitions. My guess is that what they mean, what President Trump means, and maybe even what the Europeans mean is that like the Article 5 situation, and by the way, let me clarify something, even for the NATO Article 5, it does not mean, so important to understand this, because it's very badly misunderstood. Article 5 does not mean if one country is attacked, everybody else is at war. What it means is if each country is attacked, it will be considered as an attack on all. And then this is the part where almost nobody ever goes and are unaware. It's literally specifically written into the Washington Treaty that set up NATO. Each country's parliaments and governments will then decide for themselves what they should do. Maybe they will provide verbal support. Maybe they will provide emotional support. Maybe they will provide ammunition. Maybe they will go on the ground and fight, etc. All those things have to be decided each individual country. So I suspect you'll probably get something like this. And probably Russia says, okay, as long as there are no enforcement mechanisms as part of these so-called guarantees, and you're going to just kind of have consultations and you're going to meet and discuss it and you'll wag your finger in our face if something bad happens to something, then they can agree. Because it's just really hard for me to imagine. I can't preclude anything. I'm not inside the Russian decision-making apparatus, so I don't know what their thought process is, but I cannot imagine any scenario whereby they would say, sure, you can have security guarantees with whatever end of war negotiations come out so that there will be a war with us, with Russia, and we'll agree to this ahead of time. I just can't imagine that they would say that. I think that the likelihood is that this is just going to be more words, the very thing that Zelenskyy frankly claimed that he was concerned about. And that's just the rib, because that's just the hardcore reality. Nobody is going to go to war for Ukraine against nuclear armed Russia. Understand that heading in. So then the question is, though, what is going to happen? What is possible? Because something has to change. Otherwise, we're just left with the continuation of the war where we are. And let's take now a look at the Russian side and where they are with this. We've talked to you several times in just the last few days about what the Russians said after the Alaska meeting and how they want to see this war come to an end. They're willing to have negotiated settlement, but they said they are still where they were on the June 14, 2024 lines. So to reinforce people to understand heading into this meeting where the Russian mentality is, because they keep referring to that, and then a couple of other things that have already been said here, I think you get a really good idea of where Russia will enter this. So whatever is decided today by the two meetings in Washington, it's going to have to match up in some way with stuff like this.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
I mean, he said it all right there, and I mean, almost about those last 7 or 8 seconds. Demilitarization, denuclearization, no NATO, demilitarization. All of those things have to happen, and they get all 4 territories that they have: the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk. And of course, Crimea is not even on the table to the Russians. That's already a past tense. So they have to have all the administrative borders. Subsequently, they specified all the administrative borders. Ergo, Ukraine will have to withdraw, especially from the southern 3, where they have substantial portions of those provinces still under their military control. They would have to physically, intentionally, willingly withdraw from all of those. Now, apparently what was discussed with Trump the last week in Alaska was that immediately the first thing that would have to happen was that the northern 2 in all of Donetsk and Luhansk, all of that would have to be withdrawn. They would freeze the southern part of that current line of contact, and then they would continue on with discussions along with a lot of other situations that they would be still willing to discuss a ceasefire as long as it included things like a freeze on any Western supplies to the Ukraine, a freeze on anybody else being mobilized into the war. In other words, the Ukraine side can't use this as a respite to rush more troops in, because some of the European sources are saying, and what we would want immediately is to send European NATO, European so-called peacekeeping troops into there, this coalition of the willing. That's what a lot of them are still talking about too. Russia says, no, that's not even on the table for discussion. And in fact, let me show you a couple of other things. That was in June 2024. Here is a short clip of Putin and Lavrov in December, right around Christmas time, reinforcing some of these points.
What we need is not just a ceasefire. We need peace, a long-lasting peace.
We cannot be satisfied with empty talk. So far, all we've heard is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce. And it's not particularly hidden that this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine. A truce is a road to nowhere.
And they've never changed that. And they have, by what we've heard from reporting on both the Russian and American side, that was reiterated in Alaska. We're still not interested or willing to even contemplate a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. They're only as willing to be a ceasefire with big conditions. So that's what the Russians are telling the American side here. Now, if Russia, the key question that has to be answered here today is, if Trump can't get anybody to come to his side, meaning Ukraine or Europe, and there is no deal or no agreement on the Western side, where does that leave us? Well, that's going to leave us with the war continuing on. And Russian Ambassador Novenzia in the UN Security Council last May very plainly stated Russia's position, which has not changed since.
President, we've said and want to repeat that the objective of our special military operation can be achieved through peaceful or military means. Our armed forces stand ready to continue stepping up their military activities insofar as is necessary.
So he said that Lavrov has said it directly. Putin himself has implied it. He's rarely directive in what he talks about in front. But they have all unified said this. We will either win with negotiation, we will either achieve our objectives in this, what they call a special military operation, at the negotiating table. And that's why they went to Alaska. That's why they're willing to talk in something after this, or we'll win it on the battlefield. We'll either negotiate it or take it. That is the Russian position. So the question is, what can they do? What can't they do? What can the Western position writ large do? What can't it do? Because the statements coming by the two sides remain off the charts. I mean, you can't even see them on my screen. They're so far apart. They haven't been narrowed in the least. The only thing, and again, you know that I find criticism with a number of things President Trump does, but one of the things he gets my full-throated support on is this issue here. He alone is the only person in the Western world with any kind of power that is interested in, willing, and desirous to end the war through negotiations. Now, whether he's going to succeed or not, we're going to find out in large measure by the end of this day, I would imagine. But good on him for trying. And I hope that he remains firm, because he does have the capacity and the power to compel this one way or another. We'll see what he has to do based on what happens, what he can and can't get the Western leaders to do. And by the way, Trump this is a huge high stakes gamble, not just for Ukraine, though they're the biggest ones because of the physical life and death issue, but politically, this is a massive high stakes issue for President Trump himself. Because he's got, in my view, one narrow path to success here. And if he succeeds, almost guaranteed he's going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. I would endorse it if he was able to pull this off, as hard as it would be. But it's going to be really, really hard. And that one narrow path is that he gets through coercion or whatever he can do behind the scenes with the European Union, all those European leaders who are there today. I think it's very clear they are all there in number, in person, not the VTC, not a video teleconference, because they want to in person impress upon and pressure Trump to not do what he wants and to compel him to come to their side. Guaranteed that's what's going on. That's why they're physically here. And of course, obviously, Zelensky's wanting the same thing. And that's why he loves all the artillery backup, so to speak, with the European leaders. If Trump can compel that whole group to agree to the minimum terms that the Putin administration will agree to, then we will have a chance to see this war come to an end. And Trump is right in his Truth Social. Zelensky could make decisions that could bring this war to a very, very quick outcome. That at least is a possibility. Unfortunately, I give it just a sliver of a possibility, but it does remain there, and the one that I am the most eager to see happen here. I know that will make so many people in the West angry and upset and talking about how this is laying the foundation for another war, and it may work out that way. I certainly can't say that that's not going to happen, because when people want war, they will damn sure find a way to get it. And if you don't want to find peace, and let me just kind of preach a little bit here, a bit to this mentality that so many in the West have. They don't want any kind of a win-win situation. They don't even want a neutral situation. They want, we win, Russia loses. And they won't settle for anything else. They are just lusting for that outcome. And so they are angry at Trump for even talking about the possibility of something that's even more like this. Russia succeeds. Now, the only reason Russia would end up succeeding on this, by the way, is because of the pathetic abilities of the entire Western world, to include the previous administration, who rejected every opportunity for a diplomatic solution, which could have left Russia weakened and the Ukrainian side surviving, but still in a good situation. Certainly at the Istanbul in 2022, we rejected that outcome. We could have prevented the war from coming in, and then it would have been closer to a balance. In fact, the Ukraine side might have been on the top. Because of our fecklessness and our unwillingness or inability to engage in diplomacy, we've lost that chance. Gone, past tense. So I don't care what any of these war lusters want to do now. They can harm us even worse than they have already, because their actions clearly, understand me here, their actions, the people who will be against the war coming to an end, with which shows Russia on the positive end, are the ones that are responsible for the fact that that's the best thing that Trump can get, or anyone could get right now. Because if we don't, and if we keep listening to these people who have been the authors and the writers of this disaster for our side, then it will go from bad to worse, and to potentially much worse. That's what you need to understand here. So even though they will claim, just like all the architects of the Afghan war disaster from our side specifically, the ones who were responsible for this thing failing are the first ones to continue, by the way, to continue to say that the withdrawal was a mistake. We should have stayed there forever. So they don't recognize their errors, and they want to double down and create deepening error and deepening cost for us. That's what they want to do here too. We'll see how that's going to work out here. But I told you there's some real issues here for Trump. That's the narrow path that he could get it. He compels or coerces Europe and Ukraine to give in to what the minimum acceptable side that the Russian side would have. If he can't, if the European side says, we're not going to underwrite that, we're not going to literally do a 180-degree opposite of what we just said yesterday about what we're seeking, all those things Ursula von der Leyen mentioned, and then literally give in on every single one of them. They say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep pressing, or we might give in on 1 and 2, but not 3, 4, 5, and 6, whatever their numbers are. And therefore that would fall underneath the minimum that the Russians would have. Ergo, the only path they would have left, according to their perspective and the power dynamics that exist, is just to keep pursuing the war and keep killing people. And you see on the war, on the front right now, we talked a lot about this penetration north of Pokrovsk here in the last week or so. There was a big penetration by the Russian side. Ukraine side rushed the Azov Corps down to try to contain that. Initially, so far they succeeded. I think it was about an 18 to 20 kilometer penetration the Russians had. It didn't go any further than that. They've actually lost part of it. And now then the Ukraine side has apparently lost a lot of casualties, but they have prevented it from going any further. Russian side has since that time continued on, and that have now eked back out a little bit more of that they had. They still haven't recovered all that they lost after the initial incursion, but for the moment, that side hasn't gone in. But there have been other places on the ground that has. There's just been more movements in the Kupiansk area. in the Toretsk area and south in the Kherson area. So there had been continued advancements elsewhere, and then now they're chipping back away in here. They did not have an opportunity. I thought they may have exploitation forces available. Either they didn't, they chose not to. I don't know. They didn't do it. That's the bottom line. And that, unfortunately, is given pause to many on the Western side to say, see, Russia's not that strong. We can hold out. In fact, there is some media in the Europe and Ukrainian today that says, yeah, look, when you measure from, I think it's November 2022 till now, they say Russia took maybe 1% additional territory from what they held on that day. After the Ukrainian side retook a lot of that Kharkiv Oblast and the Kherson city and several other areas down there. From that time, they say Russia has only taken about 1%. I haven't seen the numbers. I can't measure them. That seems plausible to me. They probably have. But what they don't talk about is that the massive, massive number of human losses that they have suffered in that time. They don't talk about how the Russian industrial capacity from November 22 is off the charts higher than what it was before. And now that they are producing not just more weapons, but more types of weapons, i.e. the Oreshnik, additional layers of Garin drones, the Garin 2. There's apparently some new jet-powered ones that are starting to come on. They have more maneuverability. They're harder to knock down, and their industrial capacity to produce them is still going to increase, potentially up to 1,000 per day, which is going to be devastating because that's the other area where Russia is advancing, is in the air. And there was a big attack again overnight in Kharkiv and in Odessa. There's been some major damage here right on the eve of this. And of course, Zelensky's already saying, see, this just shows that Russia isn't serious about peace. They're trying to undermine it. No, they're not at all. They're saying we will, they're reiterating what Nebenzia said last May. We will continue to fight. We will not stop on the ground or in the air, but we are wanting to have a negotiated settlement, and we'll stop anytime we come to an agreement. And if we don't come to agreement, these things will continue. You can try and reinterpret them to make Russia sound like more of the evil one, but everybody or many in the West already view Russia as the evil one. So there's nothing to gain there. And there's a lot more to lose by not acknowledging reality on the ground. So then now let's get back to the issues for Trump that he's got to really worry about is that if he doesn't get that narrow band and he can't get Ukraine or Europe or one or both to his side, now what is he going to do? That is the big question. Maybe the biggest question, why I say this is so high stakes for Trump. Because now then he's going to have to look back to Moscow. He's going to get back on the phone with Putin and say, I couldn't bring him around. I couldn't get him here. Now, Trump has laid a few hints out there with both his comments as well as Vice President J.D. Vance's comments that implying that he could walk away. But that's a really high risk for him too, because then he will be accused by a great many, certainly his political opponents here, but even some of his supporters will say, so wait. So after all this stuff, you're just getting and saying you can solve this in 24 hours. Now you're just going to literally hand it to Vladimir Putin. That's going to be the accusation. They're going to say, you are literally now, I can see this already, you are helping Russia win the war by withdrawing all of our support, by withdrawing all of our personnel, all of our training, all of our intelligence support, et cetera. You're leaving them out in the cold because the Ukraine side and the European side, they don't have enough wherewithal to fight. Though, according to these reports that I saw earlier today from Ukraine, they will try. They will continue on thinking, well, we've only lost 1% in all these years. We can keep fighting, oblivious to the fact that the core human capital that they have to fight, wage war is just fraying by the day and is about to, could literally just collapse at any moment. It still hasn't so far. But it's just rolling the dice to think that math won't eventually have its toll, because the Russian sides don't have a problem with manpower. That's just recruiting. They could do a forced mobilization. If for some reason they don't get enough people that way, they can start forced mobilization, just like Ukraine's been doing almost since the beginning of the war. So don't get any hope from the fact that Russia may have to go to a mobilization. You should fear that, because now then they don't have to just try to get a few more thousand per month. I mean, they can just bring in another million people if they needed to. People who have some level of military training already, former reservists, et cetera. So don't find any consolation in that, because that's not good. But Trump will have to face that threat and that charge if he goes down that path. Or his alternative is then to say, okay, well, I can't just walk away because I don't want to be accused of that. So instead, I'll just keep doing it. I'll just keep giving them weapons. I'll keep, all the intelligence stuff. We'll keep doing all that too. That's got a price as well, because our stockpiles, as I've talked about many times and has been talked about openly in the Western press, is very critically low. Our defense industrial capacity, very much in contrast to the Russian side, is not able to replenish losses greater than what they're being used. We're still not even caught up. By most reports I've seen, it will be 5 years once the war ends for us to replace all the categories of things that we're supposed to have in our stockpiles replaced. And then that'll just be getting us back to 2022 levels. Not enough to actually fight a sustained war if we have to get into it with a peer or near peer enemy. So there is a risk that you could further degrade our own national security just because you don't want to face the charge that you're actually helping the Russian side. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, they're prepared for all outcomes. If they get the negotiations that they want, if they say that, then they are willing to end the war. They have motivation to do so because they desire to get beyond the war and to start reestablishing something close to normalized relations with Europe and with the United States, because they know that long term, this is going to be a blip and a piece of a chapter of history, just like so many other wars over the centuries have been. They're looking beyond this as well. Whereas we're not looking beyond anything. We won't even move to the next level, much less looking years down the road like the Russians are. So they do want to end this, and they will end it in negotiation. But they also say what we're not going to do is submit on things that they view as just setting the stage for another level of armed conflict later on by no demilitarization or no denuclearization or no denazification as they view it. So those are things that Russia doesn't want to give into. But here's the thing. Keep going back to this, they don't have to. They can keep going down this military path. Let's say that this situation, this Pokrovsk, shows that Russia doesn't have the ability to really ramrod something down there and have this big operational move, and so they can't go fast. I know one of my colleagues has argued this at war. Who knows? Maybe that's right. I have thought that no, they have more capacity. They're just not showing it all right now. But if they get push comes to shove, they can. Maybe my colleague is right, and they can't. But they do have the numbers. They do have the industrial capacity. They do have the firepower. They do. And over time, that will have an impact. It's a war of attrition. It's just going to happen that way. Wishful thinking, hoping for a miracle. It's not going to change any of that. And eventually Russia will get it, whether sooner or later. They will get what they need. We have to make sure we look out for American interests. That is what is expected of the leader of every country. If Emmanuel Macron thinks that it's in France's national interest to fight this, that's something he can figure out. If Keir Starmer thinks that it's worth going into debt to help Ukraine, and that helps somehow Britain, I don't agree with it, but I'm just not my country. My country is the United States, and our country we do not benefit from a perpetuation of this war or its continuation or its loss by the Ukraine side. That is not in American national interest. Our interest is getting this war over as soon as possible to stop the physical bleeding of the Ukrainian people, to stop the bleeding of our ammunition, weapons, and industrial side that weakens our own national security. That is in our interest, and to keep this from escalating, going beyond. Because as long as the war goes on, there remains the possibility of miscalculation, stupidity, accident, some kind of an error, that something happens across some border or something, and all of a sudden people start overreacting, and all kinds of bad things can happen like that. Hasn't happened so far, thank God. But the longer the war goes, the more there's a possibility, and we need to prevent that. That is what is in American national interest. So those are the things that I'm watching for today. Big high stakes meeting with Zelenskyy here in just a few hours from now with President Trump, and then the one followed by Europeans right after that, about an hour or so later. So I think somewhere around probably 3 or 4 this afternoon, we should probably have a pretty good idea. If possible, we may come back on and give you another show later. But for sure, actually at noon today, we're going to have Colonel Doug McGregor, who's going to give his view on some of this stuff. And we're going to have some information we didn't talk about today about what the American side is going to do. And Doug is going to give information and views like only Doug McGregor has. I promise you don't want to miss that. A little over an hour from right now. Tune in then for the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. See you then.